Hello again. In this last lecture of the series on philosophy and coaching, I want to ask the question, so what have I learnt? This is partly for the entirely selfish reason that the best way of learning about any subject matter is to try to teach it. But it's also because I not only want to try and figure out what I've learned myself from this course of lectures on how coaches might enhance their professional effectiveness by attending to philosophical questions. I want to recapitulate, or at least to single out some highlights, which I hope, though we've mentioned them before, I hope will be major takeaways for you from this course. Now, I'm doing this because, first of all, I want to form a view for myself about the course and how it has gone. That's a fairly obvious thing. I want to identify the questions about the course where I would like to know what I think. But mainly, I want to illustrate by example how in all forms of teaching, in which I include coaching, we can carry out the kind of self-examination of what we have done so that we are continually learning how to do better in the future. And as I say, this applies to teaching sessions and coaching sessions. Now, in evaluating work, whether it's work carried out in a coaching session or any form of formal teaching, there are a number of questions that it's useful to ask in structuring that evaluation. First of all, what was I trying to do? What were my objectives? Secondly, how was I trying to do it? What methods was I employing? Thirdly, what do I need or lack in order to do it well or better? What resources did I use or do I need in order to do it well or better? Then, what were the highlights of the lectures or sessions? What were the successes, in other words, that I can build on in the future? And then, what should I do differently in the future? What went wrong? What were the failures that need to be remedied? And finally, I need to ask, what problems was I trying to solve, and where was I trying to try out new ideas and strategies to solve them creatively? If I can't answer this question, namely, how might I solve the problems that confront me better, I'm liable to get stuck in a rut, and my 15 years of teaching, say, or of coaching, say, will turn into one session of teaching or coaching repeated 15 times. So we must ask and answer these questions if we ourselves are to learn not only how to live and to do our work better, but how to live our lives better, which is the most fundamental question which philosophy gives to questions in all other disciplines their point. And this really is my first highlight. Whatever you do, answering philosophical questions will illuminate the nature of what you're doing and what you're trying to do. Now, my objectives in considering the lessons from philosophy for coaches and coaching were overtly at any rate, the overt objections were to contribute insights from the main branches of philosophy, which may be valuable to people whose work consists in trying to enable other people to live better lives. Then I was trying to impart information about the so-called big questions of philosophy and what I believe the best answers to them to be. But in some ways, more important than offering answers to big questions and seeing whether you agree with them or not, was the matter of enhancing particular skills, namely analytical skills, critical skills, and imaginative skills, so that we can understand more clearly what we're talking about, so that we are less vulnerable to being taken in by rhetoric, jargon, and received opinion, and we are better able to see what the world looks like to people who are very different from ourselves. So, for example, an issue which exercises me a great deal is how I, as an old middle-class, westernized white male, can understand what the world looks like to young South Africans not in employment or education who have just emerged from a largely broken public schooling system. And the answer is the world must look very different to them than it does to me. For one thing, whereas I consider Nelson Mandela a hero, they consider him a traitor. And I need to get my mind around that. But there are plenty of other examples, which I'm sure you can all think of from your own experience. And then I also want to encourage coaches to engage in deeper examination of their own beliefs about what matters most in their lives and what they should be trying to do about it. In other words, I don't want you just understanding your clients. I want you to understand yourself, not just their values, but your own values. Then, of course, I have a covert, as we all do, objective in undertaking a teaching or coaching session. First of all, I wanted to learn about online teaching. Then I wanted to work out for myself something I've never done before, which is to work out what is the relationship between philosophical questions and questions that arise in the coaching process. Now, in my case, this is rare for me, my objective here was not to make money, at least not yet. And that's sometimes not actually just an altruistic motive. For example, when I was much involved in gambling, I wrote a book about gambling, which I reckoned might sell 200 copies and make me about 750 Rand. It was an enormous amount of work, but I didn't do it for the money. I did it because A, it would help me get a promotion, but B, even more important, it would help me get clients for my consulting work. So very often there are things which are worth doing which have financial rewards other than that which involves being paid for the work one is doing. Now, similarly, the objectives of coaches are mostly overt. We're trying to help people to identify what they really want from their lives and how they can build on their existing talents and enthusiasms in order to get what they want, and how they can address the internal and external obstacles which are preventing them from getting the things they want. And the things they want will always involve, ultimately, a matter of feelings and a desire to feel good about themselves. Then we're trying to help people, and this is very important, this, at least in my experience, we're really trying to help people to learn for themselves how to help themselves and stand on their own feet. My personal experience is that I've often tried to help people either materially or in terms of advice, and completely failed because I haven't been making it clear that my objective is not simply to solve their immediate problems for them, but to help them to solve similar problems in their lives in the future without any help from outside. So we're in one of those peculiar professions, of which there are several, where our real objective ought to be to make sure our services are no longer needed. But then, in addition to that, of course, we all have a covert objective. That is, coaching is our profession and we need to make a living out of it. This suggests that quite often there may seem to arise conflicts with money and self-love on the one hand, or self-interest, and altruism, which is unselfish caring about the welfare of other people. Well, there's certainly one sense in which good coaches, sorry, I'm just dealing with noises in the background. There's one sense in which good coaches facilitate their own growth, i.e. practice self-love, in the process of trying to help others, i.e. be altruistic, to grow in health, well-being, and spiritual goods like spiritual goods such as peace of mind, hopefulness, self-respect, gratitude, and goodwill. And to illustrate this, I'm always moved by a scene in the film which was made about the foundation of Alcoholics Anonymous with Liam Hudson in the role, no, not Liam Hudson, somebody else, his name I've now forgotten, in the role of Bill W. And there's a crucial scene, which of course was based on real life, where Bill W. was in a far away town on business, and he suddenly realized he had a desperate craving for a drink and needed to talk to another alcoholic. And by ringing around the local churches, he eventually managed to find a doctor who was a self-confessed alcoholic who was willing to see him. But the alcoholic, who was Dr. Bob, was quite clear that he was really doing this just out of compassion, or possibly a sense of professional medical ethics. And so he told his housekeeper, or whoever it was, that after 20 minutes, she was to come and knock on the door and to tell him he'd got another appointment or he'd got a phone call. So Bill went round to see Bob, Dr. Bob, and Bill started telling him his story and about his Bill's recovery from alcoholism, or at least his remission from alcoholism as he understood it. And Dr. Bob interrupted him and said, well, young man, it's extremely kind of you to take the trouble to come round and try and help me with something that everybody knows is my problem. But I can assure you, nobody knows more about it than me. And I'm afraid you aren't the first person who's come to try and help me. I have seen medical experts of every description. I have sought spiritual counseling because I'm a believer and a regular churchgoer, but I'm afraid none of them have been able to help me. My case is hopeless. To which Bill replied, no, 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 you don't understand. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing this for me. At which point there was a knock on the door and the housekeeper came in and said, Dr. Bob, and Dr. Bob shooed her away and said, no, don't interrupt, nothing else matters. And they spent the whole night talking. So that's an example of where what is in fact seems to be altruism, that is trying to help somebody else, is in fact the best way of trying to help yourself. And so altruistic and self-interested motives are identical. But there's another story from the founding of Alcoholics Anonymous, which tells in a different direction. And this, of course, is probably well known to you. It's about when Bill and his early alcoholic colleagues were very keen to expand the work of AA and to go into publishing and hire buildings where all sorts of publicity could take place for the program, to buy up hospitals where therapy could be given based on the program, and so on. And Bill happened to know Nelson Rockefeller, who was one of the richest people in New York at the time, and indeed a great philanthropist. And Rockefeller said, well, I'll tell you what, I'll ask some of my rich friends round and you can tell us all about it. And so Bill went round to this dinner with all these millionaires in New York. And afterwards, one of Rockefeller's colleagues came up to Bill and said, that was absolutely wonderful. The work you're doing is splendid. I'm hugely impressed. Congratulations, keep it up. But we're not going to give you any money because this thing is built on love and money would ruin it. Now, I must say, I always think of that story when I think about, I think with some resentment, I'm afraid, about overcharging psychiatrists who mainly retail drugs, and indeed treatment centers, which are quite clearly and pretty ruthlessly profit-driven. You may be interested to know that in the New Testament, in the early days of the early church, there was somebody called Simon who decided it would be a good idea to start monetizing the gifts of the Holy Spirit, the gifts of grace. And so he set up shop, charging for what he claimed was access to the gifts of the Holy Spirit. And the early church didn't approve of that at all. And indeed, Simon met a very brutal and sudden and premature end. And ever since, that sin of trying to sell salvation for money has been known as the sin of simony. Well, we should be aware of the sin of simony too. On the other hand, damn it, we need money. We have families to support, and we want to enjoy all the trappings of middle-class life. We can't live on bread alone. We want curries too. So we've got to do something about money and in our professionalism, professional lives. One interesting solution was told to me by a man who is the head of the Center for the Study of Addictions at Harvard Medical School, whose name is Howard Schaffer. And in addition to his university work and medical work, he sees patients privately. And what he does is he says, you must pay for this. I don't know and I don't care how much you pay, but I expect money to appear in my account every month regularly, or I'll stop seeing you. And he left it to the client to decide how much they would pay. This is not actually very different from churches, or indeed 12-step meetings, which passed round collection boxes in order to receive donations. But of course, most professionals just charge on an hourly basis. And this can cause problems because many of the people we want to help, they can't actually afford to pay the fees. So this is an issue which people have to work out for themselves. I think the only thing that I have found confirmed, both institutionally and personally, is that whatever you do about money, you must do it at the beginning or before you start coaching, and you must be clear to secure agreement about who will pay how much for what. This means that your transactions with your coachees must be transactions between informed and willing buyers and informed and willing sellers. There must be no force and no fraud. And this, you may be interested to know, is the fundamental prescription of all economic activity. Well, let's now look at some problems of method. They're rather mundane, but they've certainly exercised me. The first one is simply, how do I transfer land-based contexts, teaching in a land-based context, i.e. a classroom or a lecture theatre, to what is virtual broadcasting? So my own objective being to learn a lot about the differences and similarities between teaching and coaching online as opposed to doing it face-to-face. That's one of my objectives. And this means that I have to think about things that are different, like, for example, the length of sessions. The positive fact that there's no need for coaches or students to take notes. On the other hand, there's a lack of face-to-face contact, and there are no body languages clues about how what you're saying is going down. I can't do what I do rather notoriously when I lecture, which is to walk about a lot gesticulating. Another problem is that I don't know anything about the audience any more than I would if I were doing a radio program. In fact, I know less about the audience than if I were doing a radio program. Now, to overcome some of these difficulties, lectures online and indeed offline should be supplemented by written material, webinar discussions, availability for individual student questions, and giving students detailed feedback on an individual basis on any work they may do on the course, whether it's written or in oral face-to-face talking. However, in a sense, none of this matters, because the greatest service a lecturer can provide to students, and it's something that is probably harder to do in some ways online, is to stimulate enthusiasm for finding out more about whatever it is that you're trying to teach people about. And I don't know how much this goal applies to virtual coaching, both in terms of its being virtual and in terms of its being coaching rather than teaching. But certainly in teaching, a very important issue, I mean, perhaps the most important issue, is the generation of enthusiasm for learning more. Now, there are some things that are obviously advantageous about virtual teaching and presumably virtual coaching. Thus, both teachers and coaches, and indeed trainers of teachers and coaches, now have hugely increased potential markets. That is, you can lecture, and I believe I am lecturing now, to people all over the world. And there is, in principle, no limit to the number of people I might be lecturing to, or who might access this lecture once it's been downloaded and made available online. This indeed is the principle behind what are becoming increasingly common, particularly in American universities, which are called MOOCs, MOOCs, mass observation, mass online, I've forgotten what the other O stands for, courses. Then another advantage of online work is that recorded material can be viewed or heard when students find this convenient. Similarly, teaching periods can be much shorter and much more flexible to meet the timetables and the attention spans of individual students. Then, not unimportantly, doing this sort of thing online is much more cost effective. You don't need to hire a hall. You don't, and you can, as it were, process far more people at any one time. Another advantage is that lectures can more easily be revised and improved continuously, so that people don't just go to one lecturer, and if the lecturer is not in good form or something goes wrong, then that's it. They've lost it forever. The lecture is not typically repeated and they have no second chance. Whereas online lectures can be improved and revised continually. And finally, the quality control with online work can be ruthless. This is in stark contrast to the typical evaluations you get in formal schools and universities of online of land-based lecturers and teachers. And so this ruthless quality control actually, though it sounds rather intimidating, is a great boon because it creates the potential for rapid and constructive professional self-development of a high order. Right, I now want to move, in some ways, reiterating things that I have talked about in the course of the lectures, but just to pick out some of the highlights, and you can think of this, if you like, as a sort of very short revision session. But there are certainly things which, for example, I would want to stress in other contexts to other students and would be interested to know, to get any feedback from you about. First is that philosophy and coaching are both actually forms of self-help activity. It was Socrates who said, "The unexamined life is not worth living." And this highlights the need for both coaches and clients to engage in deep and honest self-examination. So that would be one highlight about the philosophical connection to coaching. Then the second one, which has three parts, in philosophy and coaching, we need to pay close attention to the meanings of words. We need to attend to the meaning of the words we use and which others use in speaking to us. And we need to pay this close attention, first, to avoid deceiving ourselves, and second, to avoid being deceived by others, and third, to ensure that we ourselves are not being misunderstood. Then there are some highlights which struck me about the relationship between religion and morality and coaching. First of all, as I said, there are two views about the ultimate reality of the human condition. That is the ultimate question asked by people who practice metaphysics. The two views are, this must be all there is, and This can't be all there is. When I say this, I mean this life as we know it, which seems to exist for no purpose, as does the world in which we live it, and which seems to end forever in death. Some people think that must be the truth about the human condition. But other people think this can't be all there is. There must be some point to it all, and it can't all end just futilely in eternal annihilation. And that seems to me to be the main difference between a religionless view of life and a religious view of life. Now, though there are good and bad reasons for each view, any certainty with which either view is held goes beyond what the evidence supports. And that means it requires faith. Now, the second highlight about the human condition, we are creatures. What makes us uniquely human is that we are creatures who have evolved far more than any other animals to anticipate alternative possible futures and to adapt our behavior in ways which we believe is most likely to bring about the future states of affairs which we judge most desirable. All animals are capable of anticipating very short-term futures. Even very primitive organisms can engage in avoidance behavior. Some animals can engage in, for them, medium-term behavior, especially, I'm told, elephants, who are, somebody was telling me the other day, are actually the most intelligent animals on the planet, apart from ourselves. But we, of course, can anticipate the future and possible futures indefinitely. And indefinitely means not only from here until we die, but from here until beyond our death. And that makes a difference to what we think is the most desirable possible future to try and bring about. Now, fortunately, almost everyone, whether they hold a religious or a religionless view of the world, believes that we should seek to reduce pointless suffering and enhance many kinds of enjoyment for others as well as for ourselves in life before death. Very few people believe that we should live lives of thoroughgoing and ruthless selfishness. Now, the short answer, given as I think I told you by Freud, to what is truly worth desiring in life is the ability to love and the ability to work creatively. And that seems to me to be ultimately what we want our coachees to be able to do. And this connects with the emphasis I put on the importance of vocations. We should conduct both our personal and our professional lives as if a God of love was calling us, even if there is no such God. We should live it as if such a God was calling us to use our unique combination of talents, energy, and enthusiasm to make the world, in the unique situation in which we find ourselves, a somewhat better place than it otherwise would have been. That is a noble and inspiring ideal, and to the extent that we pursue it, we find that it's also personally highly fulfilling. It has the consequence that we should put the rewards of money, status, and pleasure in our careers and our relationships within the framework of following a vocation to be a force for good in the world. In other words, there's nothing wrong with the pursuit of money, status, and pleasure in our careers and our personal relationships. But we must pursue these things within the context or framework of following a vocation to be a force for good in the world. So I now want to say something about what seems to me important about all this for effective treatments. First of all, the human brain is nearly infinitely malleable. This means, very specifically, that talking to people and being talked to, no less than taking drugs, alters brain behavior. So the charge that talk therapy has no basis in neuroscience is simply wrong. And this is why I regret the fact that too many psychiatrists seem to me to be merely expensive retailers of medication. But secondly, as I've stressed, all the research evidence suggests that the crucial variable in whether clients get well, learn to live happy lives, transform their current situation into a better one, and achieve progress in the pilgrimage of recovery. The crucial variable for all that is that the client believes that the person trying to help them really cares about them. And it doesn't much matter who the person trying to help them is, but it's crucial that the client believes they are really cared about. Now, it would seem to me that effective treatment, therefore, consists in getting the client to consider whether what their behavior, for example, addictive behavior, suggests that they want out of life, and what they really want out of life. If what they really want out of life is not being provided by their actual behavior, what do they need to do or stop doing in order to get it? Now, I tell you a bit about my own case. For me, as I think I told you right at the beginning, I have been through many, many forms of treatment, most of which didn't do me much good. For me, to get into recovery and stay there, and I hope make some progress as a recovering addict, I needed to change my values. In particular, I needed to realize that much of my addictive behavior was connected with frustration and resentment about not being appreciated and indeed rewarded for being the stupendously important person that I thought myself to be. In other words, I had a craving for importance. And what I had to realize was that it doesn't actually matter whether I'm very important or not. Certainly, it doesn't very much matter whether I'm perceived to be very important or not. And that, for me, was a very important step on the road to recovery, a crucial step. And if I was going to stop craving recognition and applause and praise and those sorts of things, and appreciation, what was I going to want instead? Well, I wanted to live as a senior citizen. I wanted such time as remains to me to be fulfilling and productive in terms of work, and I wanted to die on the best terms possible with the people I most care about. So I had to completely switch my priorities in what I actually wanted out of my life. And it seems to me some sort of similar change in people's values is necessary in order to get from being imprisoned in addiction or depression or anxiety and getting into a place where one can transcend these things. But having said that, I think we all, as coaches, and indeed in respect of our own lives, we need to bear in mind another thing that Freud said, and which I've quoted, which is that the best cure is a change in the reality situation. It seems to me that one of the reasons why rehabs have such a poor track record in terms of relapses and in quite short time after people leave the rehabs is that rehabs don't, on the whole, pay much attention to anything other than what goes on during the period while the client is in the rehab. Now, in the rehab, the client is taken away from the world of work and personal relationships, which is for them so unsatisfactory that they need to escape it with some form of addictive behavior. So it takes them away from that. It keeps them for 4 to 6 weeks in a safe place. And if they can get the client to cough up, then puts them in a halfway house. But sooner or later, usually sooner, they then eject the client back into exactly the same real life situation that drove them to their addictive behaviors in the first place. And so, not surprisingly, not many make it to 2 years of clean and sober time, but many of them don't make it to 2 weeks. Now, another case study doesn't involve me, but involves 2 people I've been closely involved with, a mother and a daughter. And the mother had a serious addiction problem, but lived in a very difficult home environment, as did the daughter, where there was lots of sort of family stress, many of the problems of sheer poverty, and an inability to find work. For the daughter, the problems were really those of a standard juvenile delinquent. And why I mention these 2 is because they both, the mother over a long period and the daughter over a short period, were in and out of treatment facilities on a revolving door basis. And similarly, the daughter went from one school to another from which she played truant and so on. And it was only when they could both be moved to a different environment, in one case, a different house, and in the other case, a boarding school. It was only then that they were able, because of the changes in their real life situation, to cease seeking to escape it all the time by resorting to drugs and delinquency. Now, that's not the end of the story, because as we know, recovery is an ongoing process, and as it were, getting clean and sober for once is only the start of the process. But these stories do really strongly confirm that anyone who's been in rehab, and indeed people who haven't been in rehab, badly need the coaching process. They need to be coached so that they can be reintegrated into real life. And that seems to me to be something that in the past, before the work of places like the Ubuntu Center, has been drastically lacking in publicly and privately funded treatments for addiction and other serious psychological disorders. Well, finally and quickly, what would I do differently if I were to give this course again? Well, one thing I've been trying to do today is to do with technical issues. I try to spend more time looking at the camera and less time reading from my notes. I would also try and give the whole course a better and clearer structure. I think that was partly my fault that the structure was not, to use a wonderful word, perspicuous. That means easily transparent to the people listening to these lectures. But it was also because I didn't really know who I was lecturing to, what they wanted to hear, what they were hoping to get from the lectures, or what they were trying to accomplish. And I would structure them more clearly in the light of knowing those things. In this particular case, though normally, and I have done this myself in a long career of lecturing, I've never given the same lecture twice. I would normally need to review, revise, and refresh whatever I did last time. I don't need to do that in this case because I haven't done it before. I think more informally, I need to relax more and also to do more speaking without text. And that's one relies on a text in the same way that one relies on a kind of security blanket. I think there's a value in writing a text because it means that students have got something they can take away and see on the page, as well as simply hearing or viewing. What about substance? Well, what would I do differently? I think I would have more concrete real life situation illustrations, because I think those make rather abstract philosophical issues concrete for most audiences. I think I'd be less ambitious in terms of the content. I wouldn't try to cover all the main branches of philosophy. I would be more focused. I would stress more than I have that teaching people how to think well is essential to teaching them, is essential to helping them live well. And it requires being able and willing to explore the best that can be said against what you yourself believe to be true about the world. And that might be your political views, your religious views, but it might also be your understanding of yourself. There might be evidence that, for example, you're not so smart as you thought you were, or that actually you haven't got your behavior quite under control, or that your motives aren't as pure as you thought they were. And it's a good discipline to say, well, what would someone who wanted to deny what I most passionately believe, what would they say against what I believe? And I suppose in the process of this, I would want to be more radically unsettling than perhaps I have been. I have been aware of not only not wanting to offend people, which is a reasonable thing not to want to do, but I think I would want next time to risk unsettling people's existing convictions and possible complacencies more than I have. So if there is a next time, that's what I'll be trying to do. Meanwhile, I've enjoyed this. I wish I knew more about you all. I hope we will find a way of communicating further in the future. And I wish you everything of the best. Thank you very much. End of lecture, end of course.